The criminals who ruled the city thought he was just another man, wealthy, alone, an easy target, a car worth stealing, a dog easily discarded, a crime with no consequences. They had done worse before to men who knew better than to fight back. But this man was different. They didn't see the years of blood behind his silence, the skill buried beneath his quiet life. They didn't know the dog they killed wasn't just a pet. It was a final gift, a last piece of the woman he had already lost, the only thing tethering him to the quiet life he had tried to build. A ruthless assassin who had left behind a trail of bodies before disappearing into obscurity. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. They had taken the last thing he cared about, and in return, he would take everything from them. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The city stretched before him like an endless sea of neon and shadows. The hum of the engine purred beneath his grip, smooth and controlled. A machine as precise as the man who drove it. Elias Caney sat behind the wheel of his black '69 Mustang, hands loose but ready, eyes flickering between the road and the rearview mirror. A car had been behind him for the last 10 minutes. At first, he thought nothing of it. Coincidence, maybe. The streets weren't empty, and people drove these roads all the time. But the longer he watched, the more certain he became. They weren't just another late-night driver. They were following him. He tested them, took an unnecessary right onto a side street. They followed. He cut across 2 lanes, down a quiet road past a closed gas station. Still there. His grip on the wheel tightened, his mind sharpening in an instant. Something old inside him stirred. The instincts he had spent years trying to silence. But instinct never truly dies. He made another turn, then another. 3 deliberate moves that no normal driver would make. The tail didn't stop. They weren't careless, but they weren't good enough. Who were they? A warning? A mistake? A ghost from his past? It didn't matter. Not yet. A long stretch of road opened ahead, dark and empty. Elias exhaled slowly and pressed down on the accelerator. The Mustang roared to life, tires gripping the asphalt with precision. The tail tried to keep up, but they hesitated for half a second too long. That was all he needed. Elias cut his headlights, veered sharply down an unlit side street, then braked hard, parking between 2 abandoned trucks. The following car sped past, their headlights searching, but the road ahead was empty. They were looking for a ghost. By the time they realized they had lost him, he was already watching them from the shadows. He stayed there for a long moment, listening to his own breath, listening to the silence. Then, without a word, he put the car back in gear and drove home. But the feeling lingered. He had lost them tonight. But they would be back. The drive home should have been nothing more than a quiet return to solitude. The kind of night Elias Caney had grown used to. Silent roads, a distant city that no longer had a claim on him, and the faint hum of the Mustang's engine beneath his hands. But something about the night felt off. Not in a way that could be seen or measured, but in the way a seasoned predator knows when the air shifts, when the weight of unseen eyes lingers a second too long. He had lost the tail back in the city, but experience told him that didn't mean he was alone. Pulling into the gravel driveway, he let the headlights wash over the cabin, his gaze sweeping across the tree line before cutting the engine. The dog was already on the porch, ears perked, eyes sharp. He had always been like that, attuned to things before Elias even noticed them. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Elias stepped out of the car, boots crunching against the gravel, and as he moved toward the house, the dog trotted to his side, brushing against his leg, warm and alive. It was routine, familiar, but tonight, familiarity did little to ease the weight pressing against his ribs. The moment he stepped inside, he knew it wasn't one thing, it was everything. The way the air inside felt different, the way the scent of the room had shifted ever so slightly, the almost imperceptible sound of someone exhaling too quietly in the dark. His movements remained casual, deliberate. He shut the door behind him, locked it, then set his keys on the counter. The dog followed him in, but it was no longer wagging its tail. A voice broke the silence. Damn. This really is a nice place. Elias didn't turn immediately. He exhaled slowly, reaching toward the wooden counter, fingers brushing against the handle of a knife he always kept, tucked just beneath the edge. The voice was young, arrogant, someone who had never faced real consequences. Bet it cost a fortune. Elias turned, finally letting his gaze settle on the source. 3 men stood near the hallway, dressed in leather jackets and dark jeans, their postures too casual for someone standing in another man's home. The one in the center, clearly the leader, looked around as if appraising the cabin, eyes drifting over the furniture, the shelves, before finally landing on Elias. I saw your car out front, the man continued smirking. Gotta say, I wasn't expecting some old guy. Elias studied him, the pieces already falling into place. He wasn't here for a job. He wasn't some trained professional sent with a purpose. He was just a thief. A reckless, entitled kid who saw something he wanted and assumed he could take it. "Keys," the man said, extending a hand. Now, Elias didn't move, didn't blink. He simply stared. And for the first time, he saw something shift in the younger man's expression. Not fear, not yet, but a hesitation. As if he had expected compliance and wasn't sure what to do when he didn't get it. "That's not going to happen," Elias said, voice steady, calm. One of the men beside the leader let out a scoff. "Come on, man. Don't make this difficult." Elias didn't answer. The leader, Luca, if Elias had to guess from the way the other two looked at him, tilted his head slightly, considering him. "Look, I'm trying to be nice here. I could have just walked in, taken what I wanted, and been gone before you even noticed. But I'm giving you a chance to just hand it over. So, let's not be stupid, all right?" Elias exhaled slowly, shifting slightly so his hand was within reach of the knife beneath the counter. "You don't belong here," he said. "You don't know what you're doing." Luca's smirk widened, but there was something forced about it now. "Oh, I think I know exactly what I'm doing. You, on the other hand, don't seem to get what's happening here. That car outside, it's mine now. You give me the keys, and this all stays nice and easy." The dog growled, stepping forward slightly, muscles tensing. Luca glanced down at it, then rolled his eyes. "Seriously? You're gonna act tough with your little mutt?" Elias didn't move. His heart beat steadily, slow even. He had spent years leaving this world behind, years choosing peace over the things that had once defined him. But he wasn't sure if peace had ever truly belonged to men like him. Luca sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. "I was trying to be nice," he muttered, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a pistol, letting it hang loosely at his side, his grip too relaxed, his finger not even on the trigger. An amateur. He pointed the gun toward Elias, but the moment he did, the dog took another step forward, growling deeper now, the fur along its spine bristling. Luca's expression darkened. "Oh, for fou." He raised the gun slightly. Elias moved before he could think. "Don't." The word came out low, sharp, and for the first time, there was something real behind it. Not a plea, not a threat, a warning. Luca hesitated, looking between Elias and the dog, considering. Then he scoffed and turned slightly toward his men. "Jesus, you believe this guy? Some old man thinks he's gonna—" Elias was already moving. His hand closed around the knife beneath the counter, grip firm, motion fluid. He didn't hesitate, didn't stop to second-guess. He stepped forward, blade flashing. A fist collided with his side. He hadn't seen the third man move. Not fast, but faster than expected, just enough to throw off his momentum. The impact knocked him slightly off balance, and in that split second, the other man grabbed his wrist, twisting it, forcing the knife free. The mistake cost them. Because Elias didn't need a weapon. He drove an elbow into the man's throat, feeling the air rush from his lungs before twisting free of the grip and slamming a fist into his ribs. The man staggered, but the others were already moving. The fight had begun. The moment Elias struck, the fragile illusion of control shattered. The man he had elbowed in the throat staggered backward, gasping for breath. But the others reacted quickly, faster than he had expected, though not fast enough. Luca's men weren't professionals, but they weren't completely incompetent either. They had numbers, and that made them bold. One lunged for him, reaching for a hold, but Elias twisted out of the grip, grabbing the man's wrist and using his momentum against him, slamming him into the wooden table with enough force to rattle everything on it. The second man was already coming in from the side, and Elias barely turned in time to absorb the hit. A wild, untrained punch aimed at his ribs. Not precise, not clean, but heavy. Pain flared through his side, a sharp reminder that he wasn't the man he had been years ago, that time had its own way of keeping score. But pain wasn't an obstacle. It was just a signal, something to register and move past. He shifted with the blow instead of resisting it, using the motion to angle himself away from a second strike. The man overextended, off balance for just a moment, and that was all Elias needed. A sharp pivot, a step inside the man's reach, 1, 2 quick strikes to the solar plexus, then a sharp elbow upward, connecting with his jaw. The man reeled back, stunned, but there was no time to finish it. The third one was already moving, and before Elias could fully reset, he felt an arm loop around his throat. A chokehold, sloppy, rushed, but strong. Elias reacted instantly, bringing his hands up to grip the arm, tucking his chin down to prevent the pressure from fully cutting off his airflow. He had seconds before it became a problem. The man behind him tightened his grip, trying to leverage his weight to drag him back, and for a brief moment, Elias's vision narrowed, the edges blurring, his muscles screaming against the hold. Then he shifted his stance, adjusting his footing, bending his knees just enough to find leverage, and with a sudden burst of force, He slammed the back of his head into the man's nose. The impact was solid. Bone cracking, a grunt of pain, and the grip loosened just enough for Elias to drop his weight, twist free, and drive an elbow into his ribs. The man folded inward from the pain, and Elias didn't hesitate. A precise strike to the side of the head, another to the throat, and he was out. That left the last one standing. The one who had gotten in the first hit. The man had regained his footing, a switchblade in hand now, holding it with the kind of misplaced confidence that told Elias he had used it before, but never against someone like him. Luca was still near the door, watching, silent now, the smirk gone, replaced with something colder. Elias could see the calculations running through his mind, the way his fingers flexed near the gun at his side, the way his stance shifted. He was realizing, too late, that this had never been a fair fight. Elias turned his attention back to the last man. The knife slashed forward, fast, aimed for his midsection. Elias sidestepped, the blade slicing through empty air, then stepped back in before the man could reset, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground, and Elias struck. One sharp blow to the throat, another to the knee, and as the man buckled, a final strike to the back of the skull. The cabin was silent now, save for the ragged breathing of the men on the floor. Luca was still standing, but he wasn't smiling anymore. Elias turned toward him, his breath steady despite the fight, his body still poised, still ready, because he had seen it in Luca's expression, the flicker of realization, the weight of it settling in his bones. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't even a leader. He was just another entitled, reckless boy who had never known what it was to be truly outmatched. "You're not just some guy," Luca murmured, and there was something new in his voice now, something Elias recognized. Hesitation. It was almost funny. He had walked into this house believing himself untouchable. Now, he was looking for a way out. Elias took a slow step forward, and that was all it took. Luca reached for his gun, fumbled with it for half a second too long, and turned sharply toward the door. The plan had changed. This wasn't about taking the car anymore. This was about getting out of there alive. But before he ran, he did something Elias hadn't expected. A single shot rang out, sharp, deafening. Elias's entire world shifted in an instant. The dog had been moving toward Luca, instinctively protective, ready to lunge, to do whatever it took to keep its owner safe. The shot caught it in the chest. The body hit the floor. Everything else disappeared. Luca didn't stop to see what happened. He was already moving, already running. The cabin door flew open, his boots hitting the dirt outside as he scrambled toward the Mustang. The sound of the engine roaring to life barely registered in Elias's ears, the weight of everything pressing into his ribs like a vice. He could have chased him. He could have torn him from the driver's seat. Could have ended this right here, but his feet refused to move. The sound of tires kicking up gravel. The Mustang vanishing down the road. Elias dropped to his knees beside the lifeless form, his fingers barely grazing over soft fur that was already growing cold. His breath felt wrong, too shallow, too strained. His hands were steady, but something inside him wasn't. There were no words, no grief, no sorrow, not in the way most people felt it. There was only absence, only the crushing weight of silence where something living had once been, and beneath it, something deeper, something that had been buried for years, something he had sworn would never surface again. A slow breath, a heartbeat, then stillness. The man who had lived in this cabin, the one who had tried to carve out something resembling peace, was gone, and in his place, something else remained, something old, something merciless. Luca had taken the car, but he had stolen something far more valuable, and Elias Caney was going to take everything from him in return. Elias knelt in the dim glow of the cabin, the world around him fading into the edges of his vision, as the only thing that remained in focus was the still body in front of him. His hands hovered just above the dog's side, unwilling to touch, unwilling to confirm what he already knew. The warmth had begun to leave, the fur no longer rising and falling with breath, the eyes that once watched him with unshaken loyalty now empty, staring into nothing. For the first time in years, he found himself hesitating, his body unwilling to move, his mind refusing to fully process what had just happened. This wasn't just a dog. It had never been just a dog. The past unfurled itself inside his mind, slow and deliberate. An old wound torn open in a way that left nothing but raw edges and aching hollowness. He remembered the day Isabella had brought the puppy home, how he had stood there in the doorway, watching as she cradled the small, squirming thing in her arms, a radiant smile on her face. "It's for you," she had said, her voice full of something warm, something soft, something that had always eluded him until she had walked into his life. He had frowned, shaking his head. "Isabella," I don't need a dog. It's not about need, she had countered, stepping forward, placing the tiny creature into his reluctant arms. The dog had stared up at him, big brown eyes full of trust, its small body trembling slightly from excitement rather than fear. It's about learning how to live with something that loves you unconditionally. He hadn't understood it then, not fully, but she had. She had always known. Isabella had seen things in him that no one else had. She had known the weight he carried, the kind of life he had led before she met him, and yet she had never once looked at him with fear. Where others had seen a killer, a weapon honed into something precise and deadly, she had seen a man who could still be saved. And for a time, he had believed her. The dog had become part of their life, a quiet presence in the home they had built together, something warm in a world that had always felt cold to him. He had never spoken about what it meant to him, had never found the words to express the way it had anchored him after Isabella was gone. He had lost her too quickly. One day she had been there, her laughter filling the rooms, her touch grounding him in a way nothing else ever had. The next, she was lying in a hospital bed, her body growing weaker, the light in her eyes dimming with each passing hour. He had sat beside her in those final days, his hand wrapped around hers, silent, helpless, knowing there was nothing he could do to stop the inevitable. And when she had gone, when the weight of her absence had settled over him like a crushing force, the only thing that had kept him from slipping back into the abyss had been the quiet, constant presence of the dog she had left behind. It had been his last tether to the life they had shared, the last thing she had ever given him, and now it was gone too. He inhaled slowly, controlled, but the air felt wrong in his lungs, thick and heavy, the edges of his vision still blurred as his fingers finally moved, brushing over the dog's fur with the kind of gentleness that had been beaten out of him long ago. This wasn't grief in the way most men felt it. It wasn't sorrow that twisted into tears, that left words unsaid, that demanded comfort. This was something quieter, something colder, something that settled into his bones like the slow encroachment of winter. He wasn't the kind of man who could mourn like others, because for him, grief had always had a shape, and that shape had always been violence. He exhaled, slow and measured, his gaze lifting slightly, settling on the faint smear of blood across the wooden floor, the last remnants of the struggle, the last trace of the men who had stepped into his home, believing they had the power to take something from him. They had made a mistake. Luca had made a mistake. Elias moved with a deliberate slowness, standing, his body heavy, but his mind sharpening into something cold, something lethal. The hesitation, the stillness, it was gone now, replaced by something far more familiar. He crossed the room, stepping over the bodies of the men who had fallen in the fight, paying them no mind, because they had never been the ones who mattered. They had only been obstacles, minor inconveniences in the grander scope of what was coming next. Luca had left him no choice. He made his way to the hidden compartment beneath the floor, pressing his fingers against the nearly invisible seam. The wood gave way beneath his touch, the panel shifting, revealing the case inside. He lifted it, the weight of it familiar, the past coiled tightly in his hands as he unclasped the metal locks and pulled it open. The weapons inside gleamed under the dim light, meticulously maintained despite the years, because he had always known, deep down, that peace had never been his to keep. He reached for the gun first, the weight of it settling into his palm like an old friend. Then the extra magazines, the knife, the tools of a life he had once sworn he would never return to. He had tried to walk away. He had tried to be something else, something better. But men like him weren't made for peace. Luca had stolen his car, but that wasn't the crime. The crime was taking the last thing that had mattered, the last piece of Isabella's world that had still existed beside him. And for that, Elias Caney was going to take everything from him. He slid the gun into its holster, securing the knives, his movements methodical, precise. A man stepping back into the only world he had ever truly belonged to. Tomorrow, he would find the first name. By the end of the week, Luca's men would be gone, and soon Luca himself would understand what it meant to be hunted. The city at night was a different thing entirely, alive in ways that daylight could never reveal. Its streets filled with those who thrived in the dark, who made their business in whispered conversations and quiet transactions. Elias moved through it with the ease of a man who had never truly left, even after all these years, even after swearing he would never step back into this world. But oaths meant nothing when the past refused to stay buried. Luca Salieri. The name meant nothing to him. The kid had been in his home, standing there like he owned the place, cocky, entitled, believing that just because he had a gun and men at his back, he was untouchable. But Elias didn't recognize him. That was unusual. Elias had known the names of every man worth knowing in this city back when he was part of it. Who they worked for, how they moved, how long they would last before they ended up dead. But this? A nobody with a famous last name. That meant one of two things. Either he was a new player, or he was someone's problem that had been kept quiet for too long. And if there was one thing Elias had learned in his time walking among killers, it was that there was always someone who knew more than they should. The bar was exactly the kind of place where that knowledge lived. Old, quiet, tucked into the forgotten corners of the city, where men sat in booths that no one looked into, where deals were made under the pretense of casual conversation. Elias hadn't been here in years, but nothing about it had changed. And neither had the man behind the counter, Marcus Vale. He had been Elias's contact for years, back when Elias's work had demanded information, back when knowing the right things at the right time had been the difference between walking away and bleeding out in an alley. Marcus wasn't an informant in the traditional sense. He was just a man who made it his business to know everything, and more importantly, to know who needed to hear it. Tonight, Elias needed to hear it. He stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him, his presence drawing only a few glances before the other patrons returned to their drinks. Marcus was at the bar, wiping down a glass with the same detached patience he had always carried, as if nothing in the world could surprise him. But when he looked up and saw Elias standing there, something flickered across his face, something between recognition and wariness. "Well," Marcus muttered, setting the glass down. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you again." Elias pulled out a stool, settling onto it without a word. Marcus studied him for a moment, then sighed, reaching for a bottle and pouring 2 glasses without needing to ask. "I'm guessing this ain't a social call." Elias picked up the glass, letting the weight of it settle in his hand before speaking. "I need a name." Marcus smirked faintly, shaking his head. "You always do." He leaned against the counter, studying him. "But I get the feeling this one's personal." Elias exhaled through his nose, taking a sip before setting the glass down. "Luca Salieri. Tell me about him." Marcus's expression didn't change, but Elias knew him too well to miss the subtle shift in his posture. "Huh," Marcus murmured, reaching for his own glass. "That's a name I didn't think I'd hear coming out of your mouth." Elias waited. Marcus took a slow sip, then set the glass down with a quiet clink. "Kid's the son of Victor Salieri. You remember Victor?" Elias nodded once. Marcus let out a short breath. "Yeah, well, the old man used to be sharper, smarter, ran things clean, kept the blood off the streets as much as he could. But Luca? He's different. Grew up in his father's shadow. But he doesn't have the discipline, doesn't have the instincts, thinks he can do whatever he wants, just because of who his father is. Victor's tried to keep him out of real trouble, but you know how that goes." Elias did know. Men like Luca never lasted long. They made enemies too quickly, trusted the wrong people, thought they were untouchable until the world proved them wrong. And now, the world was about to prove it. "Why are you asking?" Marcus asked after a beat, his gaze sharper now. "You don't just come back for something like this." What did he do? Elias could have told him, could have said the words aloud, made it real in a way that it hadn't quite settled yet, but instead, he only lifted the glass to his lips again, taking a slow sip, letting the silence answer for him. Marcus watched him, then let out a low sigh. "All right." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Word is, Luca's hiding out at the docks. His father set him up with a safe house after he pulled something reckless a couple nights ago. I don't know what, and I don't think Victor does either, because if he did, that kid would already be dead." Elias set his glass down, rolling his wrist slightly, letting the information settle. "You're not gonna let this go, are you?" Marcus asked. Though he already knew the answer, Elias met his gaze. "No." Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. "Then I hope you're ready for what's coming." Elias pushed the glass forward slightly, a silent acknowledgement, then stood. He had what he needed. The first step in the hunt was always knowing where to start, and now he did. The safe house was built for discretion, tucked away in the quiet outskirts of the docks, where rusting shipping containers and forgotten warehouses kept secrets better than men ever could. It was the kind of place designed to make someone disappear, to exist just outside the city's gaze, where names didn't matter, and the only thing that did was the ability to stay unseen. Victor Salieri had chosen it carefully. He had used it before, on the rare occasions when things had needed to be kept away from prying eyes, when men had crossed the wrong lines, when debts had to be collected without the spectacle of the city watching. But tonight, as his car rolled to a stop outside, gravel crunching under the tires, he felt something unfamiliar creeping under his skin. Something he hadn't felt in years. Dread. The air was thick with it, the kind that settled into a man's bones before his mind had fully caught up with why. He knew, without needing to be told, that something was wrong. His driver stepped out first, scanning the perimeter, but there would be nothing to see. If there had been a threat, it wouldn't be waiting outside. It would already be inside, waiting for him. Victor exhaled slowly, steadying himself as he stepped out of the car, adjusting the weight of his coat. The subtle shift of the pistol against his ribs, a small comfort. His son had called him in a panic earlier. Voice clipped, rattled in a way Victor had never heard before. Luca had done something. Something reckless, something stupid. And now, he was holed up here, waiting for his father to fix whatever mess he had made. That was how it had always been. He entered without knocking, the air inside thick with cigarette smoke, the remnants of cheap whiskey lingering in the air. Luca was sitting at the small kitchen table, a half-empty glass in front of him, a bottle near his elbow. He didn't look up when Victor stepped inside, but the way his fingers curled slightly around the edge of the table told Victor everything he needed to know. "Tell me," Victor said, his voice even, measured, but carrying the weight of expectation. Luca exhaled sharply through his nose, rubbing a hand over his face, before finally looking up. "It was nothing. Just some old guy. We took his car. That's it." Victor didn't react, not at first. He simply stood there, the silence stretching between them. Waiting. Luca shifted uncomfortably. "He got in the way, all right? I told him to give me the keys, he wouldn't. So, we handled it. That's it." The words were said so carelessly, so thoughtlessly, as if they had no weight, as if they meant nothing. Victor's gaze sharpened. "Handled it how?" Luca scoffed, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe he was being questioned about something so trivial. "We roughed him up, left him there, took the car." He hesitated, just briefly, before adding, "Shot his dog." Silence. A silence so complete, it felt like the room itself had stopped breathing. Victor's expression didn't change, but something in the air did. Something heavy. Luca frowned, shifting in his chair. "What?" Victor didn't answer. He turned slightly, his hands bracing against the counter, his head lowering just a fraction as if he were trying to ground himself. Luca let out a short, nervous laugh. "What, Dad? Why are you—" "Say it again," Victor murmured, his voice quieter now, but sharper, like glass waiting to break. Luca blinked. "What?" Victor turned then, his eyes locking onto his son's, something in them so distant, so cold, that for the first time in his life, Luca felt a flicker of something he had never associated with his father. Fear. "Whose car?" Victor asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Luca hesitated. Whose car did you take?" Luca swallowed, his confidence cracking. Something shifting in his gut now. Something uneasy. It was just some guy. Victor stared at him, silent, waiting. Luca's mouth felt dry. He cleared his throat. "Caney. Elias Caney." "I don't." Victor closed his eyes, and for a moment there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the weight of that name hanging in the air, suffocating, pressing into the space between them with the force of something unstoppable. Then Victor exhaled, slow, measured, as if steadying himself against something too large to contain. "You." He opened his eyes, and when he looked at Luca again, there was no anger there. No fury, just acceptance. A slow shake of his head. "You shot his dog?" Luca flinched, his back pressing slightly against the chair. "I didn't. Yeah, but it was just a—" Victor didn't let him finish. He turned, bracing himself against the counter again, his fingers pressing into the worn surface, his breath slow, deliberate. "Luca," he said, his voice quiet, empty in a way that was somehow worse than shouting. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Luca let out a nervous laugh. "Jesus, Dad. It was a dog, not—" Victor turned sharply, his voice rising for the first time. "Not just a dog." Luca froze. Victor took a step forward, his face unreadable, his voice calmer now but no less sharp. "Do you know who Elias Caney is?" Luca swallowed. "Some nobody who—" "No." Victor cut him off, shaking his head, his voice softer now, but full of something heavy. "No, he is not a nobody. He is a man that you do not cross. He is a man that you do not steal from, and he is a man you do not take from. Because when you do, he doesn't just come for you, he erases you." Luca's mouth opened, but no words came out. Victor exhaled, stepping back, rubbing a hand over his face. "God, help us." And for the first time in decades, Victor Salieri felt true fear. Luca sat there, the weight of those words pressing into his chest, but his pride wouldn't let him acknowledge it. "Not yet," he scoffed, shaking his head, trying to brush off the creeping unease that had begun to settle in his bones. "Dad, you're overreacting. The guy was just—" "Shut up." The words weren't loud, but they cut through the air like a blade. Luca felt his jaw tighten instinctively, his mouth clamping shut, because something about the way his father had said it, the complete lack of anger, the sheer weight of it, told him that this wasn't like before. Victor wasn't mad. Victor was terrified. He turned slowly, gripping the back of one of the wooden chairs, his knuckles white against the surface, his breathing measured but forced, as if he were trying to keep something worse from slipping out. He didn't look at Luca right away. He just spoke, his voice quieter now, controlled, but no less sharp. You were inside his house. Luca shifted in his seat, uncomfortable now, in a way he didn't quite understand. Yeah, and what did he do? Luca let out a short, humorless laugh, rubbing his hands over his jeans. Nothing. That's what I've been trying to tell you. He just sat there. I told him to give me the keys, he didn't, so we put him down. Simple. Took the car, left him there. I mean, yeah, he got a couple good hits in when things got rough, but come on, he was just some washed-up old... The slap came fast. Not a wild, angry strike, but something deliberate, controlled. A statement. Luca's head snapped to the side, his jaw burning from the impact, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked, stunned, his hand instinctively moving up to his face as he slowly turned back to his father, his mind barely able to process what had just happened. Victor's voice was even. You mean to tell me that you stood in front of Elias Caney, beat him in his own home, stole from him, killed his dog, and left him alive? Luca clenched his jaw, still feeling the sting. Yeah, and? Victor let out a quiet, humorless chuckle, shaking his head slightly. And now, 3 of my men are dead. Luca's breath hitched just slightly, his body tensing. Victor tilted his head, watching his son's expression shift. Didn't know that, did you? He let the words settle for a moment, then stepped forward, lowering his voice. They found them tonight, scattered across the city. 2 in an alley, another one in his own apartment. No signs of struggle, no screams, just gone. Luca swallowed. That, he hesitated, forcing a nervous chuckle. That could have been anybody. Victor's expression didn't change. No, Luca. It couldn't. Luca shifted in his seat, his bravado slipping further. He thought back to that night, to the way Elias had just stared at him. The calm, unshaken way he had sat there, as if he was waiting for something. Not in fear, not in anger, in calculation. Victor exhaled sharply, pacing now, his mind already running through the options, through what had to come next. You think he didn't fight back because he couldn't? You think he just let you do what you did because he was weak? Luca didn't answer. Victor turned, eyes locking onto him. He let you do it because he was deciding whether or not you were worth killing right then and there. And now that he's decided? He shook his head. Now, he's hunting. Luca's stomach twisted. Victor inhaled, rubbing his hand over his face. I can fix this. Luca exhaled in relief. Good. So, not for you. Luca's body went rigid. What? Victor didn't answer. He reached for his phone, already dialing. Luca's stomach dropped. Dad, what are you doing? Victor lifted the phone to his ear, pacing slightly. The call connected. Put out the contract. Luca's chest tightened. Dad, $5 million. I want every man worth a damn to know. It's him or us. The voice on the other end murmured something in confirmation. Luca's pulse pounded in his ears. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Jesus, you're serious? You're putting a hit on him? Victor lowered the phone, staring at his son. I'm not putting out a hit, Luca. I'm buying us time. Luca shook his head, panic creeping into his voice now. You're acting like he's some kind of unstoppable. He is. The words hit like a hammer. Victor stepped closer, his voice sharp, clipped, as if he was finally losing the last bit of patience he had left. You don't kill a man like Elias Cain. You slow him down. You throw enough bodies in his way to make him stop long enough for us to find a real way out. Luca stared at him. And if we can't? Victor exhaled, steadying himself, as if saying the words out loud would make them real. Then we die. The city had always been a place of quiet violence, where power shifted not in grand battles, but in silent killings, in men disappearing without a trace, in names whispered through alleyways just before they were buried. Tonight, that silence had been broken. Elias Caney stood in the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, the cool night air pressing against his skin, his eyes steady as they traced the faint smudges of blood staining the edge of his sleeve. The last of the 3 men Victor had spoken of lay motionless at his feet, his lifeless body curled against the damp pavement of the alleyway, his breath long since stolen by the night. 3 men. The first had been easy to find, his routine as predictable as any man who thought himself untouchable. Elias had watched him slip into his car outside a low-end club, waiting for the exact moment when he was alone before slipping into the back seat, pressing the cold steel of a silencer against the base of his skull. No last words, no struggle, just the final exhale of a man who never even saw the end coming. The second had been different, more cautious after the first had gone missing, paranoia setting in like a sickness. He had barricaded himself in his apartment, keeping a gun within reach, jumping at shadows that hadn't yet materialized. But Elias was patient. He waited for the right moment, slipping inside through the open window of the fire escape moving through the dark like a phantom. By the time the man had registered that he wasn't alone, the fight was already over. And now, the third, the last of them, had been smarter, had seen the pattern and tried to run. But running had never saved anyone. Elias had caught up to him in the alley, his breath coming fast, his fear tangible. "Please," the man had begged, his voice hoarse. "I had no choice." Elias had studied him for a long moment, weighing the words. Then, quietly, "Neither do I." Now, with all three gone, the message had been sent. The ones responsible were falling, one by one, and soon there would be only one left. Luca. Elias exhaled slowly, adjusting his coat, his mind already turning toward the next step, when the sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He didn't react immediately, didn't tense or turn, because he recognized the way the footsteps moved, the familiar cadence of someone who had once been an ally. This is getting messy. Elias finally turned, his gaze settling on the figure who had stepped into the dim light. A tall man, lean but strong, dressed in dark clothing that blended into the night, his face partially hidden by the brim of his hat. Cal Morrison, an old acquaintance, one of the few people in the city who had always managed to stay on the fine line between being useful and being a threat. He had been a broker of information once, a man who made it his business to know what others didn't, to keep himself positioned just outside the reach of real danger. But tonight, he was standing too close to it. Elias didn't speak, just watched as Cal sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before letting it drop back to his side. "I know what you're doing. Hell, the whole city's starting to figure it out." His eyes flickered toward the body on the ground, then back to Elias. "And Victor? He's figured it out, too." Elias said nothing. Waiting, Cal exhaled sharply. "They put a bounty on you, Caney." The words settled between them, the weight of them heavy but unsurprising. Elias hadn't expected Victor to just sit back and wait for the inevitable. He had been in this game long enough to know how men like Victor operated, how they scrambled when control started to slip through their fingers. Still, he tilted his head slightly. "How much?" Cal huffed a humorless laugh. $5 million. He let that sit for a second before adding, "And from what I hear, there's no shortage of people willing to take a shot at it." Elias absorbed that information with the same cold detachment he had always carried. A bounty meant that the city would be hunting him now. It meant that every man desperate enough to believe they could take him would come crawling out of whatever hole they had buried themselves in. It didn't change anything. Cal studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "I gotta ask, Caney, is this really about the kid?" Elias's gaze sharpened slightly, and Cal lifted a hand as if to cut off the question before it could fester. "I get it. They came into your house, took your car, killed your dog. But I've been around long enough to know that a man like you doesn't do all this because of a single bad night. So tell me, what's this really about?" For a moment, Elias considered not answering, but there was no point in silence here. Cal wasn't a threat. He was just someone trying to understand the storm before it reached him. "They took the last thing I had left," Elias said finally, his voice even, steady. "I gave up everything for a chance at peace, and they destroyed it for nothing. Now, I'm going to make sure they understand the cost." Cal was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, shaking his head. "Jesus, Caney." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a pack of cigarettes, tapping one against the side before slipping it between his lips. He didn't light it, just let it sit there, thinking. Then, finally, he spoke again. "You're going to need more than just a gun this time." Elias met his gaze, something shifting behind his eyes. "I know." Cal hesitated, then nodded slightly. "I can get you supplies, locations, but after that?" He exhaled. "We never spoke." Elias gave a slow nod. "Understood." Without another word, he turned, moving toward the shadows, the weight of the bounty already settling across the city like an omen. Tomorrow, they would come for him, and tomorrow, the first of them would fall. The city moved differently when men were hunting. There was a shift in the air, a weight that pressed against the streets, carried in the way conversations quieted when certain names were spoken, in the way shadows seemed to stretch just a little longer. Elias Caney could feel it, the pull of something inevitable, the slow tightening of the noose that had been set for him. He had expected the bounty. Victor Salieri was many things, calculating, ruthless, careful, but he was not a man who allowed chaos to fester in his world without trying to cut it out. A contract like this was never meant to be about killing Elias. It was about stalling him, about throwing enough bodies in his path to slow him down, to buy Victor time to find a way out of the storm that was already coming for him. But Victor had underestimated one thing. Elias wasn't slowing down. He sat in the dim motel room, the hum of a distant freeway vibrating against the thin walls, his hands moving with quiet precision as he checked the weight of his pistol, slipping the suppressor into place before tucking it into the holster beneath his coat. He had felt the shift the moment the bounty had gone out, had seen the change in the faces of the men he passed on the street, the way their eyes lingered just a second too long, calculating, considering. They were already here, 6 of them, moving like they had a plan, believing, wrongly, that because they had numbers, they had control. They had been careful, staying just out of sight, watching, waiting for the right moment, unaware that their moment had already passed. Elias pushed back from the table, standing, rolling his shoulders as he exhaled slowly, letting the weight of what was about to happen settle over him. Outside, the night carried on as it always had. Distant sirens wailing, neon signs flickering against rain-slick pavement, the low hum of music bleeding through the alleyways. The city didn't care about what was coming. It never did. He stepped out onto the street, moving with the kind of ease that came from knowing exactly how this would play out. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting, and they came to him. The first was sloppy. He tried to be subtle, slipping into Elias's peripheral as if he were just another pedestrian, but his footsteps were too deliberate, his posture too controlled. Elias didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him, just listened to the way his breathing hitched when the others began to close in, boxing him in toward an empty alley. They thought they were leading him somewhere. They thought they were in control. Elias let them believe it. He stepped into the alley, slowing just slightly as the sounds of the city faded behind him. The hum of life disappearing into something quieter, something more intimate. Footsteps echoed behind him, then to the side, then ahead. They had him surrounded. Elias stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the leader stepped forward, a man with a scar across his cheek and too much confidence in his eyes, the kind of man who had killed before, but had never known what it meant to fight. He smirked, tilting his head slightly, his hands resting casually at his sides, too relaxed, too sure of himself. "You know why we're here." Elias lifted his gaze, meeting the man's eyes, saying nothing. The smirk widened. 5 million's a hell of a number. Makes a man wonder if he should just let himself get caught. Elias didn't answer. The man exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly. "Yeah, didn't think so." The first one moved, lunging forward, and that was all it took. Elias shifted, sidestepping smoothly, his hand snapping out to catch the man's wrist, twisting it sharply as a gun slipped from his grasp. A single, fluid motion sent the weapon skidding across the pavement as Elias drove his elbow into the man's ribs, feeling the breath leave his lungs in a sharp, broken gasp. The second was faster, coming in from the side, a knife flashing under the streetlights, but Elias was already moving. He ducked beneath the blade, stepping into the man's space before driving a knee into his stomach, sending him staggering back against the alley wall. The leader reacted next, pulling his gun, but Elias had closed the distance before the barrel could even lift. His hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist, twisting it outward as he drove the muzzle into his own chest, forcing him off balance before slamming him against the brick with a sharp, calculated force. The others hesitated now. Elias could feel it, the hesitation creeping into their movements, the sudden realization that this was not the fight they had prepared for. The fourth man turned to run. Elias let him go. One survivor was enough. One man to carry the story, to spread the fear, to let them all know that this wasn't a man they could simply hunt. The leader gasped for breath against the wall, his hands shaking slightly as Elias pressed the weight of the gun against his ribs. "Tell them," Elias said, his voice quiet, even. "Tell them what you saw." The man swallowed hard, nodding stiffly, his pulse hammering beneath his skin. Elias stepped back, watching as the remaining men scrambled to pull themselves together, dragging their wounded as they disappeared into the night, the weight of their failure pressing into their backs. The city would know by morning. The first wave had come, and the first wave had fallen. Elias rolled his shoulders, adjusting his coat as he turned, stepping back into the streets as if nothing had happened at all. Tomorrow, more would come, and tomorrow, more would find out who he was. The silence in Victor Salieri's study was thick, the kind that suffocated rather than comforted, pressing against the walls, settling into the spaces between words not yet spoken. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow from the liquor cabinet casting long shadows across the polished mahogany desk where Victor sat, his fingers steepled in front of him, his expression unreadable. The first wave of men had gone after Elias Kane last night. 6 of them. 5 were defeated. The last had run, barely making it back, his breath ragged, his hands shaking as he stammered out the story of what had happened, how they had tried to box him in, how they thought they had control, how, in less than 2 minutes, they had been torn apart. And now, the city knew. Victor inhaled slowly, listening to the quiet murmuring of his most trusted men standing across from him, their voices low, but laced with something they rarely carried, hesitation. Not outright fear, Not yet, but something close enough. Luca sat off to the side, his fingers drumming against the armrest of the leather chair, his leg bouncing in barely concealed tension. He was trying to act as if this didn't affect him, his expression carefully blank. But Victor had known him too long to miss the cracks forming beneath the surface. "This isn't working," one of his men finally said, breaking the silence, his voice edged with controlled frustration. "We put the bounty out to slow him down, not to turn him into a ghost story. And now that's exactly what's happening. The more bodies we send after him, the more this city remembers who he is." Victor exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. "I know." The bounty had not deterred Elias. If anything, it had sharpened him, made him move with purpose, made him remind the world that he had never been prey, only a predator choosing not to hunt. And now that choice had been stripped from him. Luca scoffed, leaning back in his chair, feigning indifference. "So what? We just keep sending idiots after him until he gets tired?" Victor turned his gaze toward his son, the weight of it enough to still the nervous movement of Luca's leg. "No." Luca frowned. "Then what?" Victor straightened, his fingers tapping once against the desk before he leaned forward slightly. "We stop sending fools." The shift in the air was immediate. The men standing before him stiffened slightly, their postures straightening, their attentiveness sharpening, because they understood exactly what he meant. The bounty had drawn out mercenaries, desperate men, opportunists looking for a quick payday, believing that Elias Caney was just another name on a contract, that he could be taken down with brute force and numbers alone. They had all been wrong. Now, it was time for something else. Victor reached for his glass, swirling the amber liquid inside before taking a slow sip, his gaze never leaving the men before him. No more hired guns. No more desperate fools looking for a payday. We do this right. He set the glass down with deliberate care. "I'm sending in our own." A slow, creeping silence stretched across the room. Luca sat up slightly, his bravado faltering for just a second before he caught himself. "Wait, our guys? You mean?" Victor nodded. Luca let out a short laugh, though there was nothing amused about it. "Jesus, Dad, you're acting like we're at war." Victor's expression didn't change. "We are." Luca's lips parted slightly, but no words came. One of the men stepped forward slightly, his voice careful. "Which unit?" Victor studied him, then lifted a single finger. "The Wolves." Luca inhaled sharply, his composure cracking just slightly before he forced it back into place. "You're serious?" Victor didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The Wolves were his best. Not men who followed the same rules as the rest of his organization, not men who moved with the same caution or restraint. They were trained, methodical, former military and special forces, men whose loyalty had been earned through blood, men who didn't ask questions, only executed orders. They weren't just enforcers, they were hunters. And now, they had a target. Luca forced another laugh, shaking his head as if trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "All right, sure, send them in. This guy's had his fun, but he's just one man. The Wolves will put him down fast." Victor's eyes flickered toward him. Luca met his gaze, but there was something there now. Something just beneath the surface. Something uncertain. Victor leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but heavy. "Do you believe that?" Luca scoffed, waving a hand. "Of course I do." Victor didn't speak. He just watched. Luca shifted under his gaze, gripping the arms of his chair a little tighter. "Come on, Dad. I mean, yeah, the guy's dangerous, but let's not act like he's some unstoppable force. He's just—" Victor exhaled through his nose, standing up slowly. Luca stopped talking. Victor moved toward the cabinet, pouring himself another drink, letting the silence stretch, letting his son sit with his own words, forcing him to feel them. Then, finally, without turning, he said, "The first time I met Elias Caney, he walked into a room with 12 men waiting to kill him." Luca swallowed. Victor took a slow sip of his drink, then turned, his expression unreadable. "He walked out alone." Luca shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping against the chair again, his composure slipping in ways he didn't want to acknowledge. Victor let the moment settle, then placed the glass down with quiet finality. "The Wolves go in tonight." One of his men nodded sharply. "Understood." Victor inhaled deeply, letting the weight of it settle into his ribs. If this didn't work, there would be no stopping what came next. The air inside the motel room was thick, the stillness pressing in like the weight of a loaded gun waiting to go off. Elias sat at the edge of the bed, one boot planted against the floor, the other resting against the wooden frame, his pistol in his hands, his movements slow, methodical, his fingers gliding over the slide, checking the magazine, ensuring every piece of the weapon was exactly as it needed to be. The weight in the air told him everything. They were coming. Not reckless men chasing a payday, not the desperate and the foolish who had convinced themselves that 5 million was worth dying for. No, These were different. The air always shifted when men like this were near, the kind of men who had spent years honing their instincts, who knew how to move without making a sound, who knew how to kill without leaving a trace. Elias had known Victor would send them. The bounty had never been meant to end him. It had been meant to stall him, to slow him down, to force him to waste time dealing with low-level killers, while Victor worked to find a way out of the storm that was already coming for him. But now, the game had changed. The wolves were here, and Victor wasn't buying time anymore. He was trying to end it. Elias exhaled slowly, his breath steady, his mind already running through the scenario, the angles, the sequence of movement that would determine whether or not he walked out of this room alive. They wouldn't storm in recklessly. They would move tactically, controlled, coordinated. They would assume they had the advantage, assume he was waiting inside, sitting in cover, forced to react. That was their mistake. The first hit came fast. A sharp, sudden explosion as the door buckled inward. The force of the breaching charge sending a violent shockwave through the room, ripping through the cheap wooden frame. The impact enough to rattle the walls, to send a haze of dust and debris into the air. Elias barely had time to move before the first man was inside, his rifle raised, his movements precise, sweeping left, while the second came in behind him, covering the opposite side. Elias fired first. The silenced round slammed into the lead man's chest, staggering him just enough for Elias to push off the bed, driving his shoulder into the second, knocking him off balance, sending them both crashing into the flimsy dresser. A third man was already coming in, his gun raising, the muzzle flashing as a shot cracked through the room, pain searing across Elias's ribs as the bullet grazed him, a sharp, burning line tearing through the flesh just beneath his vest. No time to register it. The man he had tackled was already moving, his elbow driving into Elias's side, sending him stumbling back just in time to see the first man recover, pulling a combat knife free from his belt. Close quarters. Fast. No hesitation. Elias sidestepped, barely dodging the blade as it cut through the air, his own movements shifting, adjusting, his body twisting as he slammed the butt of his pistol into the attacker's wrist, knocking the knife loose. The man didn't hesitate, his other hand coming up fast, driving into Elias's stomach, forcing the air from his lungs, making him reel just as the second man grabbed him from behind, locking an arm around his throat, forcing him off balance. He hit the floor hard, the impact sending a jolt of pain through his shoulder, his vision blurring for half a second as the two closed in, one reaching for the discarded knife, the other raising his rifle, ready to end it. Elias reacted on instinct, a sharp roll, his foot lashing out, catching the nearest man in the knee, forcing his leg to buckle, buying just enough time to reach for the broken lamp beside him, swinging it upward, the heavy metal base cracking against the attacker's skull. The man crumpled, his rifle skidding across the floor, just as the third lunged, the knife flashing toward Elias's throat. Pain tore through his shoulder as the blade grazed him, cutting deep, but he was already moving, his grip closing around the man's wrist, twisting violently, forcing the weapon free, sending it clattering to the ground. He didn't waste the opening. A quick, brutal strike to the throat, the kind that sent the body into shock, making the man stumble back, gasping for air, leaving just enough space for Elias to grab the discarded rifle, turning it against him. The silenced burst of gunfire ended it, but there was no time to breathe. The last two were still outside, waiting. They had heard the fight, heard the struggle. They wouldn't come in now, not without adjusting, without reassessing the situation. Elias exhaled, gripping his side, his fingers brushing against the warm slick of blood seeping through his shirt, his body burning, adrenaline keeping the pain at bay, but not erasing it. He moved quickly, grabbing the extra magazines off the dead man's vest, reloading, bracing himself against the dresser, his breath slowing. Two left, and they were waiting for him. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The motel was quiet now. The gunfire faded, replaced by the slow, rhythmic sound of Elias Kane's breathing. His ribs ached, the wound in his shoulder pulsing with heat, every muscle in his body carrying the weight of the fight he had already endured. Blood slicked his fingers, some his, some not, the air thick with the metallic scent of violence. But it wasn't over. The last two wolves were still out there. They hadn't stormed in recklessly after hearing the first three go down. That was the difference between them and the men who had come before. They weren't panicked, weren't looking to avenge their fallen. They were waiting, adjusting, controlling the battlefield in a way that only trained men could. Elias stepped over one of the bodies, his movements controlled despite the tightness in his ribs, his breath slowing, his ears tuned to the silence beyond the doorway. They wouldn't enter. That much was clear. They had already decided to make him come to them, Fine. His grip tightened around the rifle he had taken, his muscles tensing as he reached for the door handle. In one fluid motion, he threw it open, stepping into the hall. His gun raised. The first man was already there. A heavy boot caught him in the gut, slamming him backward before he could react. The impact sending him crashing into the motel wall. The rifle slipped from his hands as the second man closed in fast, grabbing the back of his coat, yanking him forward into a brutal knee strike that drove into his ribs, white-hot pain shooting through his side. Elias barely had time to register the second attack before the first was on him again. A sharp elbow connecting with his jaw, snapping his head to the side, the force sending him staggering. The hallway spun for a moment, his vision darkening at the edges, but he caught himself, his body moving on instinct, twisting just as the second attacker lunged in for a finishing blow. He redirected the momentum, his forearm colliding with the man's wrist, forcing the strike wide. Before the wolf could recover, Elias shifted, driving his elbow into the man's sternum, feeling the air rush from his lungs. But before he could press the advantage, the first man grabbed him from behind, yanking him into a tight chokehold, his forearm locking against Elias's throat. Pressure. His body reacted immediately, his mind assessing, calculating. The hold was tight, the leverage strong. This wasn't a rushed move, wasn't sloppy. The man behind him knew exactly what he was doing. A clean blood choke, cutting off oxygen, cutting off time. Elias's fingers dug into the man's wrist, twisting slightly, not to break free. He wouldn't waste time on that. Instead, he shifted his weight suddenly, throwing himself backward, slamming both their bodies into the motel wall. The impact rattled the drywall, but the grip didn't loosen. Fine. He reached down, grabbing the man's thigh, forcing his fingers into the sensitive nerves just above the knee, twisting with the kind of controlled precision that only came from years of knowing how to dismantle a body. The man's grip faltered just slightly, just enough for Elias to shift again, grabbing his attacker's arm and using his own weight to flip him forward, sending him crashing onto the motel floor. The second attacker was already moving. Elias barely had time to raise his arms before the next strike came, a sharp hook aimed at his ribs, catching him just enough to send another jolt of pain through his body. He absorbed it, stepping in instead of back, pressing into the man's space, trapping his arms before driving his forehead into the bridge of his nose. Blood splattered across the hall, the man stumbling, but Elias didn't let up. A brutal strike to the kidney. A sharp knee to the gut, the sound of breath leaving the body in short, strangled gasps. The first man was back on his feet, moving fast, lunging forward, a blade flashing in his grip. Elias twisted at the last second, feeling the edge slice just barely across his ribs, his own hand snapping out to grab the attacker's wrist. They struggled for a second, muscles coiling, tension thick between them. But Elias was stronger, his grip shifting, his other hand grabbing the back of the man's head, slamming it against the motel wall. The man collapsed. The second one was barely standing now, his breath ragged, his face bloodied. Elias straightened, rolling his shoulders slightly, his own body screaming in protest. But he ignored it. He exhaled slowly, steady, his eyes locked onto the last man still conscious. The wolf hesitated, wiping the blood from his mouth, shaking his head slightly, then exhaling. "I get it now." Elias said nothing. The man nodded, barely breathing, his voice quieter now, something almost resigned behind his words. "You really aren't going to stop, are you?" Elias exhaled slowly. "No." The man let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Figures." Then, without another word, he lunged. The final exchange was short, brutal. The sound of fists colliding with flesh, the snap of bone breaking, the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor for the last time. Silence. Elias stood there for a long moment, his breath measured, his ribs aching, his body still buzzing with the fading remnants of adrenaline. He ran a hand over his jaw, rolling his shoulders before stepping over the fallen. It was done. The wolves had been sent to kill him, and now they were just another warning left behind for the city to find. A faint vibration cut through the silence, a low, insistent sound echoing against the motel floor. Elias turned his head slightly, his gaze settling on one of the bodies, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the phone, still clutched in bloodied fingers, its screen glowing in the dim light. A name flashed across the caller ID. Victor Salieri. Elias exhaled slowly, crouching down, his fingers wrapping around the device, his thumb hovering over the screen for just a moment. Then, finally, he answered. "Yeah." Silence. Then, Victor's voice. Low, steady, carrying something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't far from it. "Elias." Elias leaned back slightly against the wall, his fingers tightening around the phone, his voice quiet, measured. "Victor." A silence stretched between them, heavy, unyielding. Then, Victor exhaled through his nose, the sound barely registering over the static hum of the call. "I assume my men are gone." Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to. The bodies cooling on the motel floor were answer enough. Victor let out a slow breath, the faintest edge of something frayed in his voice. Something Elias knew well. Not fear, not yet, but the realization that the walls were closing in, that the path forward had already been carved out in blood, and there was no stopping it now. "You've made your point," Victor said, his tone shifting slightly. The first step toward negotiation, toward control, toward the thing men like him always reached for when the ground beneath them started to crumble. "You want revenge. I understand that. You want Luca. Fine. But we can work something out. It doesn't have to be like this." Elias let the words sit for a moment, letting the sheer absurdity of them settle before he finally spoke. "You think this is something we can talk about?" Victor exhaled sharply, the first real sign of frustration breaking through the surface. "Elias, you think this ends with an agreement?" His voice rose slightly, the anger creeping in now, something raw clawing its way to the surface. He pushed off the wall, pacing slightly, his pulse hammering beneath his skin, his grip on the phone tightening as if he could crush the words coming from the other end of the line. "He walked into my home," Elias continued, his voice shaking with something barely restrained. "He put his hands on me, took what was mine, and when that wasn't enough, he put a bullet in the last thing I had left." His breath hitched slightly, his chest rising and falling with something that felt too much like grief, too much like rage, too much like everything he had buried for years, coming back all at once. "And now you're telling me that we can work something out?" Victor didn't speak immediately. When he did, his voice was lower, quieter, the mask slipping just slightly. "I know what you've lost." Elias froze, his breath sharp, his body going rigid. Victor exhaled slowly. "Your wife, your home, the life you tried to build." A pause. "I know what Luca took from you." A sharp laugh tore from Elias's throat, bitter, humorless, carrying nothing but disbelief. "No, Victor, you don't know. If you knew, you never would have made that call. If you knew, you never would have sent your men to try and slow me down." His voice sharpened, each word cutting through the quiet like a blade. "If you knew, you never would have let your son walk out of my house alive." Silence. Then Victor's voice, quieter now, but firm. "He's my son." Elias's breath came harder, his teeth clenching. "And my wife was my life. My dog was the last piece of her I had left. Your son took them from me like they were nothing. Now I am going to do the same to you." Victor exhaled through his nose, a slow, tired breath. "You've killed every man I've sent after you. You've burned through the people who stood between us like they were nothing. And now you want Luca. Is that it?" Elias didn't answer. Victor inhaled sharply, his voice hardening. "You can't have him." Elias's hand tightened around the phone. "You can't hide him from me." "I can," Victor snapped, his voice rising for the first time. Something raw, something shaken cracking through the carefully measured control. "You think you're the only man in this city who knows how to disappear? I've kept Luca safe from worse than you, and I'll do it again. You can cut through my men. You can burn the whole city if you want to, but you will never touch my son." Elias's breath slowed, his body coiling, his voice dropping to something lower, something colder. "Then you don't understand what's coming." Victor let out a hollow laugh. "You think you're going to walk into my house, kill my son, and walk out?" Elias exhaled, his grip loosening just slightly, his head tilting as if considering. "I don't care if I walk out." Silence. Victor's breath caught, just slightly, just enough for Elias to hear it. Then his voice came back, quieter now, laced with something that almost sounded like regret. "There's nothing left of you, is there?" Elias closed his eyes, inhaling slowly, steadying himself, his pulse settling into something measured. Not anymore. The call went dead. Elias stood there for a long moment, the phone still clutched in his hand, his mind already pushing past the pain, past the exhaustion, past the weight of everything that had already happened. This was the last stretch now. There was only one thing left to do. Elias stood in the wreckage of the motel room, the weight of the call still pressing against his ribs, his breath steady, but his pulse running like an engine that refused to cool. His fingers tightened around the phone for a long moment before he tossed it onto the bed, the screen still glowing faintly with the last call log. Victor Salieri. Luca was still out of reach, but Victor wasn't. Elias inhaled slowly, exhaling through his nose, his mind already shifting, turning, recalibrating. If Victor thought that hiding his son would save him, if he believed that keeping Luca buried under layers of security would keep the inevitable from coming, then he had made the wrong choice. Elias had spent years understanding the nature of men like Victor, how they built themselves into pillars of power, surrounding themselves with loyalists and infrastructure, convinced that their name alone would keep them untouchable. But no man was untouchable. Not when you tore out the foundations beneath him. Elias's movements were slow, deliberate, his hands moving to the nearest body, searching through the man's gear, fingers brushing over magazines, knives, extra ammunition. He took what he needed, slipping a fresh magazine into his pistol, tucking a second into the inner pocket of his coat. His body ached, the bruises settling into his ribs, the slice across his shoulder stinging with every movement. But pain was irrelevant now. He had been methodical before, moving through the underworld with patience, taking his time to eliminate each piece of the puzzle that separated him from his target. But Victor had just rewritten the game. By protecting Luca, he had made himself the only way forward. Elias pushed off the bed, rolling his shoulders, letting the tension settle before stepping over the bodies and into the bathroom. The mirror was cracked, the reflection staring back at him fragmented, blood speckling his jaw, his knuckles raw, his eyes sharp beneath the bruises forming at the edge of his cheekbone. It had been years since he had looked like this, a ghost of the man he had once been, not someone who lived, someone who hunted. His fingers ran under the faucet, water running red as he washed the blood from his skin, his mind already mapping out what came next. Victor would have tightened security, would have reinforced his properties, would have started moving assets, cutting off loose ends, preparing for the next inevitable wave of violence. But there was one thing Elias knew for certain. Victor Salieri wouldn't run, not yet. He was still playing this as if it were a war he could win, still believing that if he threw enough men, enough bullets, enough strategy at the problem, it would solve itself before it ever reached his doorstep. That was his mistake, because the problem had already passed his doorstep, and now it was coming inside. Elias dried his hands, rolling the tension from his shoulders as he stepped back into the room, his fingers already moving to his phone, pulling up the map in his mind before he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a voice picked up, gruff, hesitant. "Who is this?" Elias didn't answer right away, letting the weight of silence settle. Then, his voice even, "I need an address." A pause, then quieter. "Elias?" Elias didn't repeat himself. The voice on the other end exhaled sharply. "You know how much heat you're carrying right now? The entire city's watching. Then they'll see this coming," Elias replied smoothly, his fingers tightening around the phone. "Victor, I need to know where he is." A longer pause this time. Then, a sigh. "You're not going to stop, are you?" Elias's jaw tensed. "No." Another sigh. "All right, I'll call back when I have it." The line went dead. Elias exhaled, slipping the phone into his pocket, stepping over the last of the bodies as he moved toward the door, his mind sharpening, calculating every possibility. Victor had power, but Elias had momentum, and soon he would have an address. Then there would be nothing left standing between him and the man who had built the empire that had taken everything from him. The hunt was no longer about Luca. Now, it was about finishing this. The city always knew when power was shifting. It was never loud, never an announcement or a declaration. It was something quieter, something that slipped into conversations, something that made men glance over their shoulders when they never had to before, something that turned cautious allies into hesitant enemies. Elias could feel it in the air as he moved through the streets, his body carrying the weight of the fight, his ribs aching, his shoulders stiff beneath the hastily wrapped bandages, but his focus sharper than ever. The motel was gone now, left behind like the bodies that had been cooling on the floor, the echoes of gunfire still lingering in the minds of those who had seen the aftermath. The wolves were gone. Victor's best had been sent, and they had failed. And now, for the first time, Victor Salieri wasn't the most feared man in the city. The moment Elias had stepped back into this world, it had been inevitable. The underworld had been watching, waiting, weighing the odds of whether the man they had once whispered about was truly the same as before, whether the legend that had disappeared all those years ago had returned, or if he was just another ghost trying to claw his way back into relevance. But ghosts didn't leave bodies behind. And now, the city understood. They weren't watching to see if Elias Caney would fall. They were watching to see how far he would go. The bar was quiet when Elias walked in, the kind of place where conversations never carried past the walls, where business was handled with a nod instead of a contract, where the people inside knew better than to ask questions. He had been here before, years ago, when his life had been different, when he had still believed in the idea of walking away from all of this, for good. Cal Morrison was waiting in the back booth, a cigarette burning between his fingers, his expression carefully neutral as Elias approached. He had called an hour ago, said he had the information. Now, he just wanted to know if he had made the right choice giving it up. Elias slid into the booth across from him, his movements controlled, his body still carrying the tension of the last fight, his ribs protesting against the motion, but his expression giving nothing away. Cal studied him for a long moment, then shook his head, exhaling slowly as he flicked ash onto the tray beside him. "You look like you've been through a war." Elias's gaze didn't waver. "Where is he?" Cal let out a low breath, tapping his cigarette once before leaning forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Victor's locked down. He's got security at every entrance. Every street around the property is being watched, and he's running short on men, but that doesn't mean he's desperate." "Not yet." Elias absorbed the information, his mind already piecing together the next steps. "Where?" Cal hesitated. "You really want to do this, Caney?" Elias's jaw tensed slightly. "I'm not asking again." Cal sighed, then slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "Safe house. Not one of his usual places. He's keeping Luca close, but he's not letting anyone in or out unless he trusts them. That list is getting smaller by the hour." Elias took the paper, unfolding it with steady hands, scanning the address, the layout scribbled in the corner. Cal had done his work. He always did. Cal leaned back, watching him. "You know this isn't just about you anymore, right? The city's watching. They know what's happening. They're waiting to see how this plays out." Elias exhaled slowly, slipping the paper into his pocket, his fingers pressing against the fabric, feeling the weight of what came next settle in his chest. "Then they won't have to wait much longer." Cal shook his head, muttering under his breath. "You really are coming for him." Elias met his gaze, his voice steady, unwavering. "I was always coming for him." Cal studied him for a long moment, then nodded, stubbing out his cigarette before pushing back from the booth. "You're going to burn the whole thing down, Caney." Elias didn't look away. "It's already burning." Cal exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly before standing, slipping his hands into his pockets as he stepped away from the booth. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Elias sat there for another moment, letting the weight of the city settle around him, letting the inevitability of what came next stretch out before him like the road he had been walking since the night everything had been taken from him. Then, finally, he stood, rolling his shoulders, his body still carrying the aches of the past, but his mind already on what was coming. The city knew now. The balance of power had shifted, and before the sun rose again, Victor Salieri would know it too. The city stretched out before Elias, a maze of flickering neon and forgotten streets. But tonight, it no longer felt like something alive. It felt like something waiting, as if the buildings themselves were holding their breath, as if the streets knew what was coming and had emptied themselves in preparation. The balance of power had shifted. The city had felt it. The men who still stood behind Victor had felt it. And soon, Victor himself would feel it too. Elias stood at the edge of the rooftop, his breath steady despite the dull ache in his ribs, despite the stiffness in his shoulder. His body carried the weight of every fight that had brought him to this moment, but none of it slowed him. He had endured worse. The pain meant nothing now. Only one thing mattered: the safe house in the distance, its iron gates standing as the last barrier between him and the man who had spent his life believing he could never be touched. He scanned the perimeter, his sharp gaze tracing the movements of the guards stationed along the walls, watching the way they adjusted their postures, their grips tightening on their weapons, their eyes darting toward the darkened streets beyond. They were tense, cautious, bracing for an attack they knew was inevitable. But they weren't looking behind them. Elias moved. His steps were soundless against the rooftop as he dropped down along the side of the estate, slipping into the shadows that stretched along the stone walls. He stayed low, watching the patterns, waiting for the exact moment when the guards shifted their focus before pressing forward. The first went down without a sound, his body lowering gently to the ground before Elias moved to the next, his movements swift, calculated. 2, then 3. By the time the remaining guards realized something was wrong, it was already too late. A brief moment of hesitation, a sharp intake of breath as the nearest one turned, his posture stiffening, his hand reaching for his weapon. But Elias was already moving, cutting through the space between them before the man could react, disarming him with a single fluid motion. The others barely had time to register what had happened before Elias pressed forward, forcing them back, overwhelming them before they had the chance to call for reinforcements. The struggle was brief. They were trained, but they weren't ready for him. Elias exhaled, his breath steady as he adjusted his grip on his weapon, stepping past the fallen, moving toward the heavy doors of the estate. Inside, Victor was waiting. This wasn't about revenge. Not yet. Luca was still out of reach, still hidden. But Victor was the only man who could tell him where. Elias inhaled once, rolling his shoulders, ignoring the sting in his ribs as he pressed forward. The hunt was almost over, and there was nowhere left to run. The estate was dead quiet, the weight of the night pressing into every inch of the space. The air carried a stillness that came when power had already shifted, when the last defenses had fallen, when the man sitting in his office had no one left to call, no one left to command. The walls of Victor Salieri's kingdom were closing in, and for the first time in decades, he wasn't the one in control. Elias stepped into the office, the doors swinging open with deliberate force, his presence filling the room before his voice ever had to. The dim glow of the chandelier cast flickering shadows against the bookshelves, the heavy scent of cigar smoke and aged whiskey clinging to the air, the glass of untouched liquor sitting near Victor's elbow like some final attempt at maintaining composure. Victor didn't stand, didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon. He just sat there, his fingers lightly pressed together, watching Elias with the expression of a man who had long since prepared himself for this moment. But Elias had seen it too many times before. The careful mask of indifference, the measured stillness, the illusion of control stretched thin over the first cracks of fear. Elias stopped in front of the desk, his gaze cold, his voice sharper than steel. "Where is he?" Victor exhaled slowly, tilting his head, his tone smooth, too smooth. "And what happens if I tell you?" Elias's grip tightened just slightly, the tension rolling through his shoulders, the exhaustion in his body giving way to something far heavier. "Where is he?" Victor let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "You think this ends with Luca? You think after everything, you just walk away?" Elias didn't move. Victor's smile was thin, knowing. "No, it doesn't." The words barely had time to settle before Elias moved. His fist crashed into Victor's jaw, the force of the impact snapping his head to the side, his chair tilting slightly from the weight of the blow. Victor let out a sharp breath, his hand reaching for the edge of the desk, his composure faltering for just a second before he steadied himself, shaking his head, blinking through the daze. Elias didn't give him time to recover. His hand shot forward, grabbing the whiskey glass and hurling it against the far wall, the shattering sound cutting through the air, the scent of liquor spilling into the space. Victor barely flinched, but Elias saw the flicker in his eyes, the recognition, the understanding that this wasn't a conversation anymore. This was an ultimatum. Elias leaned in, his hands pressing against the desk, his voice low, steady. "You sent your men after me. You put a price on my head. You watched as I cut through everything between me and your son. And now, you're sitting here, acting like you still have a choice. But let me make this clear, Victor." His voice dropped further, the room tightening around them. "You do not." Victor exhaled, the amusement fading just slightly from his face. "You're already gone, aren't you?" Elias's jaw tensed, his breath steady. Victor let out a slow, tired breath, shaking his head. "I knew what you'd do the second Luca took from you. I knew how far you'd go. I still tried to stop it." His voice lowered, almost thoughtful. "And you know why?" Elias didn't answer. Victor licked the blood from his lip, staring at him. "Because I still thought I could win." Elias grabbed the edge of the desk and flipped it. The heavy wood crashed against the floor, papers scattering, the whiskey bottle shattering on impact. Victor barely had time to push himself back before Elias grabbed him, yanking him from the chair, slamming him against the wall with a force that rattled the paintings hanging beside them. Victor let out a breathless grunt, his body going rigid as Elias pressed him into the surface, his arm locked against his throat, his voice no longer carrying any patience. "Where is he?" Victor coughed, his breath uneven, his hands gripping Elias's wrist, trying to pry himself free. But Elias didn't budge. "You think hurting me will get you what you want?" Victor rasped, his voice strained, but still holding that edge of defiance, still trying to hold on to whatever was left of the power he had once wielded. Elias slammed him back against the wall, harder this time, his voice quiet, deliberate. "No, but I'll break everything you have left." Victor's breath caught just slightly, his body tensing at the weight behind the words. Elias leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "I will burn every last piece of your empire. I will rip apart everything you have built. I will make sure that when I'm done, there won't be a single soul left willing to stand in your shadow. You will not just lose Luca. You will lose everything." The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Then Victor exhaled. His shoulders slumped just slightly, the last of his resistance unraveling beneath the weight of inevitability. "The docks," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Warehouse 17. Elias held him there for another moment, making sure, waiting, reading the shift in his posture, the resignation settling into his features. There was no lie in it, no trap, just the truth. Elias released him, stepping back as Victor slumped against the wall, running a hand over his bruised jaw, inhaling sharply through his nose. Elias turned, moving toward the door, his body still tight with the remnants of the fight, his mind already moving to the next step. Victor's voice stopped him. "You know they're ready for you." Elias paused. Victor exhaled, shaking his head, his voice lower, almost quiet now. It won't matter. Elias didn't answer. He stepped through the doorway, into the waiting dark, the docks, the final stretch. Luca had run out of places to hide, and before the night was over, it would all be finished. The night air was thick with the scent of salt and oil. The distant hum of cargo ships pressing against the stillness of the docks. The water stretched dark and endless beyond the piers, reflecting the glow of overhead floodlights in broken fragments, the occasional ripple disturbing the illusion of calm. But there was no calm here. Elias stood at the edge of the container yard, his body still carrying the weight of every step that had brought him to this moment. The bruises had settled deep into his ribs, each movement carrying a dull ache, the cut at his shoulder burning with every shift. But none of it mattered now. Pain was distant. The exhaustion that had crept into his muscles had no place here. Luca was close. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted metal walls standing between Elias and the end of this hunt. The structure was old, built for storing shipments that had long since moved elsewhere. But tonight, it had become a cage, a last refuge for a man who had run out of places to hide. Elias exhaled slowly, steadying his breath, his eyes scanning the perimeter. Victor's men had been thinned out, their numbers reduced to a handful of desperate enforcers, still trying to hold together the remnants of an empire that was already falling apart. They stood near the entrance, their movements cautious, their eyes darting between the shadows, their hands tight on their weapons. They knew who was coming. They were afraid. Elias moved before they could see him. The first guard barely had time to react before Elias closed the distance, his approach soundless, his presence unnoticed until it was already too late. A quick strike, precise, efficient, his grip closing around the man's collar, pulling him into the darkness before he could make a sound. A short struggle, a sharp exhale, and then silence. One down. The second turned too late. His instincts sharp, but his reactions just a fraction slower than they needed to be. Elias met him head-on, blocking the desperate attempt to raise a weapon, his own strike coming faster, knocking the rifle away before a sharp blow sent the man crumbling to the ground. Two. The third had been watching the others, waiting. And now, finally realizing what was happening, he fumbled for his radio, his voice barely breaking through the static, before Elias reached him. A single movement, quick and decisive, and he was down. 3. Elias exhaled, his pulse steady, the weight of the moment pressing into his ribs. The warehouse doors loomed ahead, the rusted metal stained with years of weather and salt, the handle slick beneath his fingers as he pushed forward. Inside, the space was vast, the air thick with the scent of dust and old cargo. Stacks of shipping crates lined the walls, the overhead lights flickering dimly, casting long, broken shadows across the floor. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of slow, careful footsteps echoed against the metal. Elias followed the sound. Luca was hiding, but not for long. His movements were cautious, careful. But the panic was already starting to show. The scrape of a shoe against concrete, the sharp intake of breath when something shifted too loudly. Luca had never been trained for this. He had never been meant to live in the world his father had built. He had been given power without the weight of responsibility, given men to protect him without ever having to learn what it meant to fight for himself. And now, there was no one left to protect him. Elias stepped forward, his voice carrying through the silence, controlled, deliberate. "You can come out now." The stillness stretched. Then a voice, shaken, unsteady, forced into something resembling control. "You don't have to do this." Elias didn't respond immediately. He let the words settle. Let Luca hear the silence pressing against him, the inevitability of what was coming. Then, finally, his voice low, even. "Yes, I do." A sharp shuffle of movement, a desperate scuffle of feet. The sound of someone repositioning, trying to calculate an escape. Elias moved toward the sound, rounding the last of the crates, his eyes locking onto the figure pressed against the wall, his breath uneven, his hands gripping the pistol that trembled in his grasp. Luca's face was pale beneath the dim lighting, his jaw tight, his fingers white-knuckled around the weapon he barely knew how to hold. Elias stared at him, unmoving, unreadable. Luca swallowed hard, his breath unsteady, his voice struggling to hold on to something that had already slipped away. "You don't have to do this," he repeated, his eyes darting around the space as if searching for an answer, for something, anything, that could shift the inevitable. "My father, he's done. You don't have to." Elias took a step forward. Luca tensed, his hand tightening on the trigger. Don't come any closer." Elias stopped, his gaze steady. Luca's breathing was too fast, his body trembling just slightly, the weight of fear settling into his shoulders, pressing against his chest, making the gun in his hands feel heavier than it should. Elias exhaled, slow and deliberate. You were never supposed to be in this world. Luca swallowed, his fingers twitching against the pistol, his breath coming shorter now, more panicked. It was just a car. Elias tilted his head slightly, his voice carrying the kind of quiet finality that left no room for anything else. No, it wasn't. Luca's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, his mind scrambling for an escape that didn't exist, his body caught between fight and flight, trapped in a moment where he no longer had control over what happened next. Elias waited. Luca exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you going to kill me? Elias's breath slowed, his body steady, his mind already knowing the answer before the question had even been asked. He didn't blink, didn't hesitate, didn't lie. Yes. The sound of the waves beyond the docks was distant, muted against the steel walls of the warehouse, swallowed by the weight of the silence that stretched between them. The cold air carried the scent of salt and rust, mingling with the thick stillness of dust and old oil that clung to the concrete. The place had been abandoned long before tonight, long before it became a tomb waiting for its last occupant. Elias moved slowly, his steps measured, deliberate, his breath steady despite the aches in his body, despite the dull burn of exhaustion pressing into his muscles. The hunt had ended, the chase was over, and now all that remained was this moment. Luca stood several feet away, his back against the steel wall, his hands gripping the pistol so tightly his fingers looked bloodless. His chest rose and fell in short, shallow breaths, his body caught in the kind of tension that came when a man had exhausted every escape and had nowhere left to go. His eyes darted toward the exit once, then back to Elias, a sharp flicker of desperation breaking through the thin layer of control he was still trying to hold on to. He swallowed, adjusting his stance, forcing himself to stand straighter, to look like something other than a trapped animal. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice unsteady, his grip shifting on the gun as though the weight of it had only just started to register. Elias took another step forward, slow, unhurried. Neither did you. Luca exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I didn't know who you were. Elias's gaze didn't waver. But you knew what you were doing. Luca's fingers twitched slightly against the grip of the pistol, his body tense, his breathing uneven. It was just a car, he said, the words leaving his mouth too quickly, as if saying them faster might somehow make them true. Elias's voice remained quiet, unwavering. It was never about the car. Luca swallowed hard, his mind scrambling for something, anything, that could shift the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. My father is finished. You got what you wanted. You don't have to do this. Elias took another step forward. Your father isn't the one who walked into my home. Luca's breath hitched, his body locking in place. Elias could see it in his posture, the sharp rise and fall of his chest, the way his pulse hammered in his throat, the way his grip on the gun was too tight, too rigid, his stance off balance, his weight uneven. He had never been trained for this. He had spent his life hiding behind men stronger than him, behind his father's name, behind the power that had been given to him rather than earned. But there was no one left to stand between him and the consequence of his choices. You think this is justice? Luca asked, his voice fraying at the edges, trying to grasp at something that was already gone. Elias exhaled slowly. No, justice would have stopped you before you ever stepped through my door. Luca clenched his jaw, his hand tightening on the pistol, his breath sharp, uneven. Then what is this? Elias took one more step, close enough now that he could see the sweat forming along Luca's brow, the fear settling into his shoulders, pressing into his ribs, stealing the last of whatever resolve he had left. This is what happens next. Luca's fingers twitched, his body reacting before his mind could catch up, the gun jerking upward, the motion sloppy, rushed, desperate. Elias moved before he could fire, his arm cutting through the space between them, knocking the weapon aside, his other hand gripping Luca's wrist, twisting sharply. The pistol clattered to the floor, skidding across the concrete, lost to the dark. Luca stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps, his hands raised slightly, shaking, his entire body caught between fight and flight, with nowhere left to run. Please! Elias didn't hesitate. The strike came fast, precise, a single blow to the ribs that sent Luca staggering, his breath leaving him in a sharp, broken gasp. Another strike followed, controlled, efficient, forcing him to his knees, his body curling inward, his hands weakly pressing against the concrete as if trying to steady himself. Elias exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulder, stepping forward, standing over him, watching as the last fragments of defiance drained from his face, leaving only fear behind. Luca looked up at him, his breath uneven, his hands pressing against the cold floor, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to do this. Elias's voice was quiet. Certain, I already did. The final movement was swift, deliberate. A single, precise strike. No anger, no hesitation, no need for anything more. The silence that followed, was absolute. Elias stepped back, inhaling deeply, letting the moment settle. The ache in his ribs, the weight of exhaustion, the dull, lingering pain from every fight leading to this moment. All of it was there, but none of it mattered now. The hunt was over. Elias exhaled slowly, his breath steady, his pulse even. He turned toward the exit, stepping out into the night, leaving the empty warehouse behind, leaving the past behind, leaving the name Luca Salieri as nothing more than another whispered story in a city that had already started to move on. The docks were quiet now. The world outside had already continued turning, as it always did, as it always would. But Elias Caney had left his mark, and the city would never forget it. The night air was thick with salt, and the distant hum of cargo ships shifting in the water. But to Elias, the world had gone silent. The weight of what had been done had already settled into his bones, the ache of every step pressing into his muscles as he walked away from the warehouse, leaving behind the final remnant of the life that had set all of this into motion. The city would feel it soon. The weight of Luca Salieri's absence would ripple through the underworld like a stone thrown into still water. The power that once seemed untouchable, fracturing under the pressure of something inevitable. Victor had spent his life building an empire, had controlled the streets with the careful balance of wealth, violence, and fear. But tonight, that balance had been shattered, and soon there would be nothing left. Elias exhaled, the pain in his ribs sharpening with the motion, the exhaustion pressing against the edges of his vision as he moved through the empty space between the shipping containers. The fight had taken its toll. The war had carved into him deeper than he wanted to acknowledge. But there was still one last thing left to finish. The low roar of an approaching engine cut through the silence, tires screeching against asphalt as a black sedan skidded to a stop just beyond the edge of the docks. Elias kept walking, his pace slow, deliberate, his body coiled, his mind already preparing for what was next. The car door swung open, heavy boots hitting the ground, and then, "Caney!" the voice carried through the night. Deep, raw, filled with something just beneath the surface that was not yet grief, but close. Something twisting behind the words. Something sharp enough to cut. Elias didn't stop. The sound of another door opening. Another set of footsteps. Then the unmistakable click of a safety being released. I said stop. Elias slowed slightly, tilting his head just enough to catch the reflection of street lights on metal. A gun. No hesitation. No warning shots. Victor Salieri was not a man who threatened without meaning it. Elias turned. Victor stood a few yards away, his coat heavy over his shoulders, his hands clenched into fists, his face cast in shadows beneath the overhead lights. His jaw was tight, his lips pressed together, his body stiff with something that wasn't fear, wasn't anger, but something colder, something final. His men flanked him, two of the last loyal enforcers still standing by his side, their weapons raised, but Elias barely spared them a glance. They were just remnants now, pieces of something already broken. Victor inhaled sharply, exhaling through his nose, his gaze locking onto Elias with something unreadable. "Do you even know what you've done?" Elias studied him for a long moment before speaking, his voice quiet, even. "Yes." A slow, bitter laugh escaped Victor's lips, but there was nothing amused about it. "You really think this changes anything?" He shook his head, taking a step closer, his boots heavy against the pavement. "You think taking my son from me undoes what happened to you? You think this brings her back?" Elias's fingers flexed slightly at his side, the movement small but deliberate. "No." Victor's expression darkened, something coiling behind his eyes, something frayed. "Then, what was the point of all this?" Elias didn't hesitate. "The point was that he never should have walked into my home." A sharp breath, a slow tilt of the head. Then Victor took another step forward, the distance between them shrinking, his voice lower now, but carrying something heavier, something edged with raw disbelief. "All of this for a dog?" The words hung between them, suspended in the cold air, pressing into the silence. Elias's jaw tightened. Victor let out another hollow laugh, shaking his head. "This empire, this city, every man who has bled and died for your revenge. And it was all for a dog?" Elias exhaled slowly, his breath steady, his voice sharper than steel. "It was never just a dog." Victor's gaze flickered, his breath catching just slightly. But he recovered fast, his expression twisting into something harder, something built from decades of power, of control, of knowing how to manipulate men into thinking they owed him their loyalty. "You're a fool, Caney. You think you're different from the rest of us? You think you're not the same man you were before all of this?" Elias didn't move, didn't react, didn't blink. Victor's voice dropped lower, quieter, almost thoughtful. "You killed my son." The words came like a hammer against stone, Elias didn't look away. Yes, Victor exhaled through his nose. Slow, deliberate. And now, I kill you. The shift was instant. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface cracked wide open, spilling into the space between them like gasoline waiting for a spark. Victor moved first, his gun raising, his men stepping forward, their hands tightening around their weapons, their movements crisp, rehearsed, ready. But Elias had been waiting for this moment since the night they took everything from him. His body moved before thought, before hesitation, before anything else had the chance to settle. His hand snapped to his pistol, his feet shifting, his weight coiling into motion. The first shot cracked through the night, Victor's men scattering, bullets slicing through the dark, cutting against the roar of the ocean behind them. Elias shifted, dodging left, taking cover behind a stack of crates, his breath controlled, his mind focused. This wasn't an ambush. This wasn't a chase. This was the last fight. Victor had come to avenge his son, but Elias Caney did not lose. Gunfire shattered the quiet of the docks, sharp echoes cutting through the still night air, the scent of salt and gunpowder mixing into something heavy, something final. The world beyond the harbor seemed distant, the city watching, waiting, as the last remnants of Victor Salieri's empire came apart beneath the weight of inevitability. Elias moved with precision, his breath controlled, his body tight with exhaustion, but sharper than ever. Every step, every shift, every motion was calculated. Each bullet fired, not wasted in reckless exchange, but placed with intention, cutting through the dark with brutal efficiency. The first man went down before he even had a chance to register. The fight had already been lost. The second took longer, his training evident, his movements crisp. But crisp wasn't enough against someone who had spent years in the kind of blood-soaked existence Victor's men had only ever been ordered into. Victor himself moved with the kind of cold, controlled rage that only came from a man who had ruled for decades, from someone who had lived his life never once considering the possibility that he would be standing here, like this, watching everything fall apart around him. His gun was steady, his posture sure, but Elias could see the tremor at the edge of his fingers. The way his breathing had changed since the fight began. This wasn't just a battle for survival. This was a man trying to salvage whatever was left of his name. Elias ducked behind a container, bullets sparking off the steel, the impact ringing against the metal as Victor's men moved, trying to flank him, trying to press what little advantage they had left. The numbers were against Elias, but that had never mattered before. They had the numbers. He had the inevitability of a man who did not stop. He shifted, sliding low against the ground, moving before they could get a fix on him. The first man rounded the corner too fast, expecting Elias to still be behind cover. The mistake cost him. A single clean shot, center mass. He stumbled back, crumpling to the pavement before his weapon could even slip from his hands. Two left. Elias pushed forward, his body tight with the motion, every part of him running on precision, the pain in his ribs distant, his mind only focused on what came next. One of Victor's men fired, the shot slicing past Elias's arm, grazing fabric, missing by inches. Elias didn't slow. He closed the distance, his grip shifting as he reached the second attacker, slamming the gun from his hand before a sharp, brutal elbow snapped into the man's jaw. The force sent him stumbling, his body crumpling into the crate behind him, unconscious before he even hit the ground. One left, Victor. The old crime lord stood just beyond the loading dock, his coat hanging heavy around his shoulders, his gun still raised, his posture firm despite everything unraveling around him. His breath was slow, controlled, his expression unreadable as he watched Elias step forward. The two men facing each other with nothing left between them now. A long silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. The harbor behind them carried the low hum of the city, distant and detached, uncaring of the blood spilled here tonight. Victor inhaled deeply, his grip steady on his weapon. You could have walked away. Elias took another step, his voice even, unwavering. So could you. Victor let out a short breath, something that might have been a laugh if it didn't sound so hollow. You think this makes you different from me? Elias didn't answer. Victor nodded slowly, as if understanding something only now. Too late. You're no different. You just needed the right excuse. Elias exhaled, his body loose despite the tension pressing between them. Maybe. Victor studied him, his fingers flexing slightly on the gun, his breath steady, his eyes unreadable beneath the dim glow of the overhead lights. Then let's finish it. And then, without hesitation, he fired. Elias moved. The shot tore through the air, missing by an inch, slicing past him as he shifted, his own weapon raising, returning fire before Victor could adjust. A sharp impact, a grunt of pain, Victor stumbling back a step, his hand instinctively gripping his side where the bullet had caught him, but he didn't stop. He raised his gun again, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with something burning, something more than just anger, more than just grief. This was a man fighting against the end of everything he had built. Elias pressed forward, closing the distance between them before Victor could fire again. The next shot cracked past his shoulder, too fast to dodge completely, pain searing along his arm. But he didn't slow. He slammed into Victor, forcing the older man backward, their bodies colliding against the rusted metal of a shipping crate. The weight of decades of power, of history, of war pressing into the struggle. Victor struck first, his movements precise, his fists trained from years of surviving his own battles. A sharp blow connected with Elias's ribs, a second striking his jaw, the impact rattling through him, but he absorbed it, pushing back, twisting Victor's wrist before the gun slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the pavement. Neither reached for it. This wasn't about guns anymore. Elias drove his knee into Victor's side, sending him stumbling back. Victor recovered fast, faster than a man his age should, his body moving like a fighter who had spent his life knowing that survival meant never giving up the ground beneath his feet. He lunged, his fists cutting through the air, his strikes practiced, brutal. Elias blocked the first, absorbed the second, then countered, his elbow catching Victor's ribs, the force enough to stagger him. But Victor didn't stop. He pressed forward, his weight slamming into Elias, driving them both toward the edge of the dock, the cold night air pressing against them as the city loomed beyond. For a long moment, neither spoke, their breaths heavy, their bodies locked in a struggle neither could afford to lose. Then Victor exhaled, his voice lower now, quieter. "You killed my son." Elias's grip tightened. "He killed my wife's." Victor's breath hitched just slightly, his expression darkening, his hands pressing against Elias's, the last remnants of his strength coiling into one final effort. "Then I guess we both lose." The fight wasn't over. Not yet, but soon, very soon. The night pressed in around them, the silence of the docks stretching out between the sounds of their ragged breaths, the slow drip of blood against concrete, the hum of the city beyond. The weight of the fight hung heavy in the air. A final reckoning between two men who had spent their lives walking a path that could only ever end like this. Elias tightened his grip around Victor's wrist, feeling the last remnants of the old man's strength coiled beneath his fingers, the stubborn resistance of a man who refused to let go, who had built himself into something untouchable, only to find, in the end, that no one was untouchable. They stood near the edge of the dock, the black water shifting below them, reflecting the dim glow of streetlights that flickered overhead, the world shrinking down to this one final moment. Victor exhaled sharply, his breath uneven, his body tight with pain, but his eyes still filled with something unrelenting, something that refused to die quietly. "You've torn everything apart," he rasped, his voice edged with exhaustion, his lips stained with the taste of blood. "For what?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He studied the man before him, the deep lines in his face, the sharp intelligence in his gaze, the slow realization creeping into his expression that there was no more power left to wield, no more men to command, no more moves left to play. For her, Victor let out a slow breath, shaking his head, a bitter, hollow chuckle escaping past his lips. "You think she'd be proud of you for this?" Elias's jaw tightened, his grip steady despite the pain creeping into his own body, the deep ache of every fight, every wound, every scar pressing into his ribs, settling into his bones. "No," he admitted, his voice quiet, even. "But I never did this for pride." Victor's gaze flickered, something shifting in his posture, something unreadable pressing into the space between them. Then, his fingers curled into a fist. The move was fast, a sharp, desperate strike aimed at Elias's ribs, a final surge of effort, one last attempt to seize control before the inevitable crash down. But Elias had seen it before it happened, had already moved before Victor's body could fully commit, his arm twisting, his grip shifting, his weight pressing forward, forcing Victor back. Victor's boot skidded against the concrete, his balance slipping for half a second, just enough, just the space Elias needed. And then, the moment broke. Elias moved. The strike came quick, precise, brutal. A sharp twist, a shift of weight, Victor's body jerking, staggering back, his breath catching in his throat as he felt it, felt the inevitability settle into his ribs, the understanding creeping into his mind. Before his body even reacted, his knees buckled. Elias let go. Victor stumbled, his back hitting the rusted metal of a cargo container before he collapsed against it. His breath shallow, his strength draining, his fingers pressing against the wound that had already decided the outcome of the night. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his coat, pooling beneath him in slow, spreading rivulets. The fight was over. The Empire was finished. Victor exhaled, his body sagging against the cold steel behind him, his head tilting slightly as he looked up at Elias, his eyes carrying something quieter now, something stripped bare of the weight of power, of legacy, of everything that had defined him. He had ruled for decades, had crushed men under his heel, had built an empire from nothing and shaped it into something untouchable. And yet, here he was, at the end of it all, watching it crumble in the final moments of a fight that had never really been a fight at all. His lips parted slightly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Was it worth it? Elias inhaled deeply, rolling his shoulders, feeling the tightness of exhaustion pressing against his ribs, the ache settling into every part of him. He exhaled slowly, watching as Victor's chest rose and fell in slow, unsteady movements, as his fingers twitched slightly against the ground, as the final moments stretched into something quiet, something empty. It was never about worth. Elias murmured. It was about making sure he never did it to anyone else. Victor chuckled weakly, shaking his head, his breath uneven. You think you changed anything? Elias tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. No, but I ended something. Victor exhaled one last time, the breath leaving his lungs in a slow, resigned motion, his body finally stilling, the weight of everything that had ever defined him slipping away into the cold night air. And just like that, Victor Salieri was gone. Elias stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet, feeling the absence of something that had once been so large, so immovable, now reduced to nothing more than an echo in the dark. The city would feel this. The underworld would shift, fracture, realign itself in the aftermath of what had been done tonight. Some would fight for the remnants of what Victor left behind. Some would try to rebuild. Some would fall into the vacuum that had been created, but none of it mattered. Not to Elias. Not anymore. He turned, stepping away from the dock, his breath steady despite the pain, his body carrying the weight of everything but his mind already drifting elsewhere. Tomorrow, the world would move on. But tonight, the last page had been written. Elias Kane was the last man standing, and with that, he disappeared into the night. The road stretched endlessly before him, winding through the silent woods, the headlights of the car carving through the darkness, illuminating the gravel path that had long since been forgotten by the world beyond. The city was far behind him now, left to sift through the ashes of everything that had happened, to whisper the name Elias Caney in hushed conversations, to wonder if he was still out there, if the storm had truly passed, or if he was simply waiting, watching, lingering in the spaces between shadows. But none of that mattered now. The weight of exhaustion pressed into his ribs, the ache of old wounds settling into his body with every slow inhale, but his mind was elsewhere, fixed on the place ahead, the only place that had ever truly meant anything. The cabin stood where it always had, untouched by time, nestled deep in the heart of the trees, its wooden frame weathered but strong, its presence carrying the quiet stillness of something sacred, something unshaken by the world beyond. The air was cold, crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth, the whisper of the wind rustling through the branches overhead, the only sound that filled the emptiness. Elias stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the night air, his fingers flexing slightly against the weight of exhaustion pressing into his limbs. His movements were slower now, deliberate, every step carrying the heaviness of a man who had finally reached the end of a road he had never wanted to walk. The grave was still there, just behind the cabin, where the trees stretched high above, where the world felt quieter, where the past had been laid to rest beneath the earth. He approached slowly, his gaze settling on the weathered headstone, the name etched into the stone softened by time, but still clear, still unshaken. Lillian Caney. His breath hitched slightly, his fingers grazing the top of the stone, his body stilling as the weight of everything pressed into his chest, the memories unraveling in slow, quiet waves. He had spent so long running from this place, from the life that had been taken from him, from the echoes of what once was, but now, standing here, everything else felt distant, irrelevant, stripped away until only this remained. The duffel bag beside him shifted slightly as he knelt, unzipping it with careful hands, his breath steady, his mind focused on the motion rather than the emotion pressing behind it. He reached inside, lifting the wrapped bundle, the weight in his arms feeling heavier than it should, heavier than anything else he had carried through the years. Gently, carefully, he laid the dog beside her. The grave had already been prepared, the earth turned, the soil loose beneath his fingers as he placed the body down. The final piece of what had been taken from him, finally given the rest it deserved. His hands lingered for a moment, his gaze tracing over the fur, The stillness, the absence of breath, the finality of it all pressing into his ribs, into his chest, into the spaces between his bones that had never quite healed. He exhaled slowly, reaching down, lifting the first handful of dirt, letting it slip between his fingers, feeling the weight of every moment that had led to this, feeling the silence press into him, feeling the world settle around him like a breath finally released. The grave was filled in silence. No words, no prayers, no promises. Just him, just the quiet, just the final act of burying the last piece of his past. When it was done, he sat back on his heels, his eyes lingering on the fresh soil, his hands resting against his thighs, his breath steady despite the ache pressing into his chest. He reached into his coat, pulling free the small, worn collar, the tag still attached, the engraving still clear beneath the dim moonlight. His fingers traced over the name, the letters softened by time, by wear, by the touch of hands that had once belonged to someone else, someone who had been taken from him long before any of this had ever begun. He placed it against the grave, pressing it into the earth, letting it rest beside her, letting it stay where it belonged. His gaze shifted, settling on the headstone once more, the name carved into it holding more weight than anything else in this world ever had. For a long moment, he just sat there. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, rough, carrying the exhaustion of a man who had spent years bleeding for something that could never be undone. "It's over." The words slipped into the night, fading into the trees, into the cold air, into the silence that stretched endlessly around him. He inhaled deeply, closing his eyes, letting the moment settle, letting the past settle, letting the weight of everything he had carried finally begin to fade. And when he opened them again, the night was still, the world unmoving, the past resting beneath the soil where it belonged. He stood slowly, his breath steady, his gaze lingering on the graves for just a moment longer, before he turned, stepping away, his body lighter than it had been in years, his footsteps soft against the earth. The cabin waited in the distance, the door still unlocked, the windows still carrying the warmth of a place that had once been home. The city would never forget him. His name would be whispered in alleyways, in the spaces between deals and betrayals, in the stories told by men who had seen what he had done and what it had cost. But Elias Kane was done. And as he disappeared into the dark, stepping through the door of the cabin, leaving the past behind where it belonged, the world outside moved on without him. For the first time in years, he let it. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.